And welcome back to our symposium. I hope everyone has enjoyed the presentations and conversations thus far. And I am here to introduce our keynote speaker. It is my honor to introduce my possibly cousin family of origin, but definitely my cousin by choice. It ain't too many Black queer Baileys running around in the academy. But it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Moya Bailey. And Dr. Bailey is an associate professor in the School of Communications at Northwestern University. Her work focuses on marginalized groups' use of digital media to promote social justice, and she is interested in how race, gender, and sexuality are represented in media and medicine. She is the digital alchemist for the Octavia E. Butler Legacy Network and the board president of the Allied Media Project, a Detroit-based movement media organization that supports an ever-growing network of activists and organizers. She is a co-author of #Activism Networks of Race and Gender Justice, published by MIT Press in 2020, and is the author of Misogynoir, Transformed, Black Women's Digital Resistance, recently dropped by NYU Press in 2021. Please join me in welcoming the famous and my cousin, Dr. Moya Bailey.
Thank you, cousin. Thank you, Dr. Bailey. That was such a wonderful introduction. I feel so welcomed. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, wonderful. So I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay, y'all can see that. Lovely. I want to begin by saying it's truly an honor to be here virtually. And I really want to thank you, Dr. Orr, for making that possible. We've been talking about this for a while now, and COVID, Omarion does not want to let us be great. So I am so thankful for the opportunity to be with you all virtually. And also a special thanks to Arizona State University, and also just even the idea of this conference, the Symposium, Rhetorics of Gendered and Sexualized Anti-Blackness. Before I even knew what that was, I was thinking about these issues. So thank you all for giving me the opportunity to be here. I am joining you all from the traditional unceded homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Ottawa, and many other tribes such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox also call this area home. I was really moved by a non-land acknowledgement that was given by Indigenous elders, really reminding us not to take land acknowledgements for granted, because they can be used to help white supremacy relax. And I'm not interested in helping white supremacy relax, but I do think that it's important to acknowledge, especially in these pandemic times, that we can kind of forget that there's this hardware that runs all over Turtle Island that connects all of our digital devices, and that hardware is made from minerals extracted from stolen land and mined by exploited people around the world, including people who look like me and look like you. When discussing my work and its social justice implications, I don't want to forget those too often invisibilized logics of settler colonialism that can become even harder to see or acknowledge with our need to turn towards the digital during COVID-19. So just an overview of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be reading from the preface and introduction of my book, Misogynoir Transformed. And I'll talk a little bit about what is misogynoir, misogynoir in media, why Black women does not equal Black feminists, my concept of digital alchemy, and something that's really on my heart and I was told is maybe my book is a Trojan horse for transformative justice, and I will take that. And so it was nice to hear the last conversation. I think Dr. Hall and I are very much vibing on a similar point as well. So I'm going to start with the preface. Although I didn't know it at the time, I started writing this book as an undergraduate at Spelman College. I was on the road to becoming a medical doctor when two things happened that made me shift course. I fell in love with women's studies, and I got international attention as one of the leaders of a small pushback on campus against the rapper Nelly. Both events profoundly shaped my thinking about the way Black women are treated in society and moved me to coin the term misogynoir, which in turn led to the book. As a first-year student from tiny Fayetteville, Arkansas, I was appalled when Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftall told the Spelman College entering class of 2005 about Sarah Bartman's experiences as a human exhibit in Europe during the early 19th century. Bartman, a young Khoisan woman from what we now recognize as South Africa, was displayed throughout Europe to paying white audiences as an example of the animalistic and inferior nature of the African woman. Implicit in Bartman's display was a comparison between her body and that of the white women who viewed her. European scientists equated Bartman's anatomical differences with sexual deviance, drawing conclusions about her sexuality and subsequently the sexuality of Black women from her form. Her butt and genitalia were used to justify racist and sexualized violence, as well as the continued enslavement of Africans in the quote-unquote New World. Dr. Guy-Sheftall explained that the exploitative way Bartman's body was treated in life and in death was made possible under the guise of objective science, though what Bartman actually endured was objectification through scientific racism and sexism. In my first week at Spelman, before I had even attended a class, Dr. Guy-Sheftall had challenged my thinking by describing the differential treatment Black women experienced on a global stage. After that moment, I knew I wanted to take every class I could with her, and I was awakened to the profundity of the unique nexus of experience that is Black and woman on this planet and throughout colonial history. So what you see here is the Cosby Academic Building, and on the second floor, the windows that are kind of pushed out, that's the heart of the Women's Research and Resource Center, and where a lot of our activism and plotting took place on Spelman's campus. And I think given Cosby's story and also Nelly being in the news again, I just find it really ironic to look back on these images of that time and where my, thinking about these issues really began. Along with enrolling in Dr. Guy-Sheftall's classes, I took classes with fellow feminist professor, Dr. M. Bahati Kuumba, who we affectionately call Dr. K, who gave me the final nudge into the open arms of the comparative women's studies major at Spelman. As I was matriculating, I also got involved in the feminist political organizations on campus, all of which were supported by the Women's Research and Resource Center, the home of the Comparative Women's Studies Department. It was Dr. K who asked, "You're taking all the classes, why not be a major?" And when she put it that way, there was really no room for a rebuttal. But in truth, I was a willing convert, despite still having every intention of attending medical school, though that was not to be. As a 19-year-old junior and then president of the Feminist Majority Leadership Alliance, the FMLA, I showed the group Nelly's music video for the song Tip Drill, which had started airing on the late night television show BET Uncut. The video featured most memorably a scene where Nelly slides a credit card down the crack of a Black woman's butt. Our group decided to name him our misogynist of the month, not knowing that the Spelman Student Government Association had agreed to partner with Nelly and his foundation to hold a bone marrow registration drive on our campus in an effort to save the life of his sister who had leukemia. FMLA raised questions about the misogynoir in his videos and lyrics, and when we heard that Nelly was invited to campus, it seemed only fair that we asked him about his representations of Black women, since he was asking for our help. He declined our offer to talk about his music. Instead, he went to the press, twisting the story such that it seemed that Spelman canceled the bone marrow registration drive because of the video, an assertion that many still believe today, though we orchestrated our own drive. The story garnered national and eventually international headlines, both praising and condemning Spelman students for daring to talk back to the music. And I'll also let you know that many of the students both praised and condemned us for ruining their chances to meet Nelly. It was a hard lesson in the hypervisibility and invisibility of being a Black woman. Nelly felt entitled to our assistance with saving his sister's life, but did not feel that he had to address us, the Black women who dealt with the fallout of his video and lyrics in our day-to-day lives. As young Black women, we felt the impact of the video and lyrics in the form of street harassment in the United States and abroad. We dealt with assumptions about our sexual availability to men in the form of unsolicited commentary on our bodies, on our clothing, and on our time. He used his celebrity built on the bodies of Black women to urge people to support an underappreciated cause, the health of Black women. Black women are far less likely to find a matching bone marrow donor than their white women counterparts, in part because of Black people's deep distrust of the systemic racism in medicine, which makes them less likely to volunteer to donate. What was not clear to me in 2004 was the irony of using a fame garnered through limiting representations of Black women while refusing to address that decision and also wanting support from those very same Black women. I wasn't quite able to connect the dots between popular media representations of Black women and my and other Black women's experiences with discriminatory housing practices, intimate partner violence, street harassment, employment discrimination, and ill treatment from healthcare providers, but my interest in the role media plays in shaping the perceptions of Black women became all-consuming, such that the goal of becoming a medical doctor morphed into getting a doctorate to investigate the role that media representations play in the treatment of Black women patients by white doctors. I learned about the way historical popular culture seeped into the consciousness of supposedly objective future physicians, which prompted me to consider how popular culture representations influence Black women's treatment in society and in medicine. It was in writing that dissertation that I landed on the word misogynoir to describe the particular venom directed at Black women through negative representations in media. How do you describe the way that Black women are uniquely denigrated because of their gender and race? I played with a couple of terms before landing on misogynoir. Initially, the term existed only in my dissertation until 2008, when I was invited to join the Crunk Feminist Collective, an online blogging community of feminists of color. The blog was a space for timely and incisive criticism, and my first post, They Aren't Talking About Me, discussed my concern about my own apathetic response to misogynoir in music. It was the word's first appearance outside of my dissertation. Once I used the word, other members of the collective started to use the term, and it appeared in more posts. From there, some members of the blogosphere began to use it, but no one more compellingly than womanist blogger Trudy at her now sunsetted Gradient Lair. Her work introduced online communities to the word, and she deftly articulated its utility. Her work and others helped the term reach a wide range of audiences, including an international one. When I coined the term, I did not expect it to go viral. In addition to appearing in the New York Times, Ebony, and the Washington Post, misogynoir has its own Wikipedia entry, which receives thousands of views every day. It's also been referenced in scholarly journals, articles, and monographs. The adoption of the term and its wide reach in digital spaces make further theorization of its use important for gender, critical race, and cultural studies audiences outside of the academy. And I hope that in addition to creating a term that's useful, I've created a book that is useful to the communities with which I study. So definitely a shout out to the earlier conversation, the people I study with, not about. And I'm going to move on now to the introduction itself. Misogynoir is a term I created in 2008 to describe the anti-Black racist misogyny that Black women experience, particularly in US visual and digital culture. Misogynoir is not simply the racism that Black women encounter, nor is it the misogyny Black women negotiate. Misogynoir describes the uniquely co-constitutive, racialized, and sexist violence that befalls Black women as a result of their simultaneous and interlocking oppression at the intersection of racial and gender marginalization. The term is a portmanteau of misogyny, the hatred of women, and noir, the French word for Black, which also carries a specific meaning in film and other media. French film critic Nino Frank coined the term film noir in 1946 to describe the gritty, cynical, and initially American movies that had unusually cruel themes for the time. The motion picture genre is characterized by its dark and sometimes sexually charged undercurrents. Examples include films like The Maltese Falcon and Sunset Boulevard. Like film noir, misogynoir originally described American media, but similarly grew to transcend borders to describe an unfortunately global phenomenon. Whether in film, television, or as I examine in the book, digital media, misogynoir has found a home in each of the communication advancements of the last 2 centuries. Misogynoir is perpetuated through popular media like cartoons, minstrel shows, yearbooks, television, movies, and even Facebook, the digital descendant of yearbooks. Black feminist theory clearly articulates the power of the image to serve the hegemony of what Bell Hooks calls white supremacist capitalist patriarchy by controlling the way society views marginalized groups and how we view ourselves. Black feminist theorists, like Bell Hooks, have discussed the importance of producing images that counter the normalizing force of stereotypes, but also expose the danger of reactionary positive images that can constrain and confine. We need complex images that break the good, bad, white, Black dichotomy. As Hooks offers in Black Looks, we should be asking ourselves questions about what type of images subvert, pose critical alternatives, and transform our world views and move us away from dualistic thinking about good and bad. Similarly, Patricia Hill Collins argues against controlling images that attempt to delimit the potential ways of being for Black women in the world. The media that circulate misogynoir help maintain white supremacy by offering tacit approval of the disparate treatment that Black women negotiate in society. Whether the Jezebel, Mammy, Sapphire, and later the welfare queen, or even the strong Black woman archetype, misogynoiristic portrayals of Black women shape their livelihoods and health. As media studies scholars attest, negative images and narratives do more than affect the self-esteem of the populations depicted. Misogynoiristic caricatures materially impact the lives of Black women, justifying poor treatment throughout all areas of society and throughout US history. Black women are caught at a vexing crossroads, hypervisible in media through misogynoir and invisible when in need of life-saving attention. Misogynoir is the visual representation of anti-Black misogyny, not only through caricature and false representations of Black women that inform how Black women are treated, but also through the omission of Black women and girls from view altogether. The so-called missing white woman syndrome, in which news media cover stories about missing white women and girls, with a ferocity that is unmatched when women and girls of color go missing, continues to belie societal claims of growing racial equality. 64,000 Black women and girls went missing in the United States in 2017. Amber Alerts are not even issued for many of these girls because there is an assumption that Black girls run away. The lives of Black women are so devalued that there is little public outcry when we are violated or exploited. When Black trans women are murdered, most often at the hands of men of color, there is no community outpouring of support for the victim or the victim's family. The life expectancy for trans women of color is just 35 years. Initiatives like #SayHerName, which I discuss in chapter 2 of the book, and the movement for Black lives are trying to make the invisible visible, but it has been and continues to be an uphill battle. Whether it is through hypervisibility or complete erasure, Black women and girls are grappling with the negative consequences of misogynoir in their lives. So now I'm thinking about misogynoir through media. There remains a belief that recognizing the misogynoir experienced by Black women detracts from efforts to support Black men and boys. In the wake of a season of unarmed Black men being gunned down by police, instances of Black women's murders at the hands of the police have not evoked the same demands for police accountability. The Boston activist and 2020 poet laureate, Portia Olayiwawa, poem Rekia Boyd asked the question, why no one showed up for a rally in Boyd's honor following her slaying by an off-duty police officer, Dante Servin, over an alleged noise complaint.
Last night, no one showed up to march for Rekia Boyd. Rekia was shot dead in the head by cops in Chicago on Monday. A Cook County judge acquitted police of killing Rekia. Dante Servin, charged of manslaughter, went jailbird free. Rekia Boyd was a 22-year-old unarmed Black woman living on the south side of Chicago, and last night, no one showed up to march at her rally. I guess all the protesters got tied up. I guess all the Black folks were busy making signs saying, "Stop killing our Black boys." I guess no one hears the howling of a Black girl ghost in the nighttime. We stay unheard, blotted out, buried, dead. Black girls receive tombstones too soon and never any flowers to dress the grave, so we fight alone. They will tell you the woes of a Black man who got beat by police in the street, beat by the man at work, beat by the system at the institution, but never of the Black woman he took his frustration out on, never of the Black girl he stretched into a casket. They will tell you of the brown boys who get pushed from school through pipeline to prison, but never of the girls who fill the cells, never of the orange jumpsuits they camouflage into. 200 Black girls go missing in Nigeria, and America puts out a hashtag instead of a search party. No one ever causes a riot. The first Black first lady is being called the first ape on all of the media outlets, and no one is outraged. There ain't no boycott or nothing down the street. A man did a hate speech to a Black butch woman, and someone gave it a 10. Someone said it was freedom poets are still over there cheering. I guess queer Black woman ain't Black enough. I guess the movement ain't meant to be a crossroad. I guess we are here for play, for make-believe, pretend, poof. How magic trick missing must I become? How tight does my noose have to ring? How long does my body need to deteriorate before anyone can smell it rot? If a Black boy gets shot by the cops, isn't that a tragedy? Ain't it the blues? Isn't it a misfortune if a Black girl gets killed by police and the killer goes free? Does anyone notice? Do you still call it a lynching? Is her rally just a rehearsal? Ain't that why no one ever shows up?
Olayiwola describes the disproportionate attention Black men and boys get when they are violated in the absence of similar demands for justice when a Black woman is killed. I argue that the silence and erasure of the violence Black women and girls endure are connected to society's inability to see them as worthwhile subjects, deserving of respect and care, a sentiment exacerbated by misogynoir. Olayiwola's words echo in the epigraph that animates this text, reminding us that since we are Black women, we quote unquote fight alone and we must save ourselves. Part of this saving includes the creation of representations that challenge the way we are viewed. Representations of Black women in popular culture help support and perhaps even bolster the harm they experience. In 2003, when 15-year-old Zakiya Gunn and friends refused the street harassment of 29-year-old Richard McCullough and his friend by saying they were lesbians, McCullough got out of the car to retaliate. McCullough stabbed Gunn and fled, and though she was rushed to the hospital, she died of her injuries. McCullough's sense of entitlement to Gunn's attention pushed him out of the car and into choking her friend and ultimately killing Gunn. His beliefs about her sexuality and his right to control and punish her for what he perceived as its misapplication have everything to do with the way misogynoir makes Black women and girls seem undeserving of their autonomy and lives. When Black women are only rendered visible and are only rendered visually as in service to men, their autonomy is not believed. Misogynoir can precipitate racist gendered violence that harms social well-being and impacts mental health, and can even result in death, the direst of health outcomes. Portrayals of Black women as straight and at the disposal of men who desire them shape our cultural landscape. When misogynoir paints all Black women as sexually available to men, Gunn's defiance is not only challenged but punished. Her health, her very life is at stake when stereotypes materialize into justifications for deadly behaviors. In 2006, when another group of Black lesbian teens tried to defend themselves against a cat caller turned attacker, they were vilified in the news as a quote, wolf pack, an inhuman gang of animals. Media's portrayal of the New Jersey Four, as their group came to be known, led to them receiving longer and harsher prison sentences, despite the fact that the young women were trying to defend themselves against a man who tried to assault the smallest in their group. This violence and these harsher sentences, as numerous studies have shown, are disproportionately visited upon Black women. While many studies have explored the physical health of Black women, few have considered premature death, mental health, physical well-being, housing, education, and access to pleasure as equally important health concerns that misogynoir negatively impacts. Beyond public health's call to address maternal mortality and the so-called obesity epidemic among Black women, there's a need to address Black women's health at a fundamental level that includes their quality of life beyond ableist metrics. Black women deserve to have accurate representations of themselves in popular culture. The images that circulate about them should support their well-being in society instead of negatively impacting their ability to live their lives. I want to move now to the way that Black women do not equal Black feminists. In writing this book, I struggled to come up with language that fully captured who is engaged with this transformation of misogynoir. The term Black woman is often assumed to mean straight and cis, with queer and trans Black women identified explicitly because of this normative assumption. Additionally, the term Black women is not inclusive of non-binary, agender, and gender variant Black folks whose experiences of misogynoir are intimately connected with the misgendering of them. I struggle to reconcile my use of a term that is central to my definition of misogynoir, yet excludes some of the people most invested in its transformation. For those of us on the margins of Black womanhood, woman is not what we name ourselves, even as misogynoir colors our experiences of the world. As you will see in this text, it is often those of us in the shadow of Black women who are the most engaged in media projects that transform misogynoir. As we in the shadows are already limited by the frame of Black womanhood, we become some of misogynoir's most vociferous opponents because it further diminishes our already limited light. When a hetero and cis-normative understanding of Black woman is used, it obscures the realities of those of us in the shade. I experimented with terms to describe those of us on the margins of Black womanhood, as I experimented with terms before landing on misogynoir. Digital spaces are rife with words, phrases, and terms that attempt, sometimes awkwardly, to address the slippage between women and all who aren't cis men. One of these terms is non-men, which centers men as it attempts to define those who are not. Non-men is used online as a catch-all term, but its use recreates the exact erasure it wants to undo. Womenex seems a useful interlocutor with its roots in pre-colonial indigenous languages and contemporary decolonial lingual practices. The X in Womenex intervenes in the racist colonial histories of English and Spanish, while also attempting to solve the problem of genders beyond the man-woman binary. That's a lot of work for one letter to accomplish. However, even as Womenex, by definition, includes gender non-binary, agender, and gender variant people who don't identify as women, reading the term in text does not make these communities readily apparent. As S.A. Smythe asked in their article on Black feminism slippages with the terms feminist and women, who all over there in Womenex? When a term is created to encapsulate those outside or alongside the term Black women, another erasure occurs. The phrase women and femmes has also been used in social media spaces to make space for those who are not women, but may find themselves hailed by the term femme, which also has contested meanings. But women and femmes doesn't quite capture all the targets of misogynoir either. There are masculine of center, agender, and non-binary people who experience the deleterious effects of misogynoir and who may not identify as women or femmes, as Sakia Gunn's murder unfortunately illustrates. Similarly, not all non-binary Black femmes experience misogynoir because they are not read as Black women in public. For some femmes, homophobia and femphobia might be the lens through which they become targets of violence. Black femphobia is an important form of oppression to discuss, but it is not a synonym for misogynoir. Misogynoir is deployed because of social beliefs about Black women, and those of us who are read as Black women, despite our self-identification, get caught in the crosshairs. Having already used my invented portmanteau, misogynoir, in the title and introducing a new framework of digital alchemy, I do not wish to overload the text with more new terms of which the reader needs to keep track. So in the book, I write out Black, non-binary, agender, and gender variant folks when necessary to prevent the continued conflation and erasure of these members of our neighborhood. I challenge you to think of Black women first when you see the word woman, to think of queer and trans women first when you hear the term Black woman. When you read the term Black feminist, do not assume that it is interchangeable with Black women, for as this text and other references make clear, Not all Black women are feminists, and not all Black feminists are women. This project and people I highlight in this text do not fit neatly into either category. Much like the media they create, these people are not easily slotted into a box labeled feminist or women. Digital alchemy. Digital popular culture includes all of the images we see online, the conversations that happen in social media, and their circulation throughout society. As I've illustrated, negative representations of Black women existed for centuries before the digital age, but these representations have been able to circulate more quickly with the advent of the internet. I build toward an understanding of digital alchemy as a praxis designed to create better representations for those most marginalized through the implementation of networks of care beyond the boundaries of the digital from which it springs. Alchemy is the quote unquote science of turning regular metals into gold. When I talk about digital alchemy, I'm thinking of the ways that women of color, Black women, and Black non-binary, agender, and gender variant folks in particular transform everyday digital media into valuable social justice media that recode the failed scripts that negatively impact their lives. Digital alchemy shifts our attention from the negative stereotypes in digital culture to the redefinition of representations Black women are creating that provide another way of viewing their worlds. I argue that this process of creating transformative images challenges the normative standards of bodily representation and health presented in popular and medical culture. This idea of transformation is essential to this book. I titled this book Misogynoir Transformed because I could not let misogynoir go unmodified. A book titled Misogynoir on its own does not represent an action or protest. I did not want to simply explain or rehearse examples of misogynoir in a book-length project. I, like the trans advocate Janet Mock, wanted an action to animate misogynoir to signal my interest in its destruction. I did not want to account for all the vile and deleterious hate that is misogynoir without making clear that there are those of us who are working to transform it. Embodied transformation, a concept from the practice of somatics as re-articulated by organizer and facilitator Adrienne Maree Brown in her book Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good, is foundational change that shows in our actions ways of being and relating and perceiving. It is transformation that sustains us over time. Transformation is achieved only when change is evident in the way we move through the world and how we continue to incorporate that change throughout time. When I talk of the transformation of misogynoir, I am interested in all of the ways that Black women and Black non-binary, agender, and gender variant folks work to transform the toxicity of these representations and images that cause them harm. While I hope for an eradication of misogynoir, I realize that a world without misogynoir requires more than the labor of Black women and Black non-binary, agender, and gender variant folks to be achieved. We can transform our relationship to misogynoir and transform the images and material consequences of misogynoir, even as we are not the ones who create it. The transformation of misogynoir through the creation of new possibilities is an essential practice of the digital alchemy that these communities engender. In the context of the book, I'm looking at the digital tools that Black women and Black non-binary, agender, and gender variant folks employ to do this transformative work. I'm actually going to stop right here and say thank you for the time, but I want to leave you with just a little bit of Adrienne Maree Brown talking about what exactly transformative justice looks like in practice.
So when I'm trying to explain transformative justice to people, I usually back away from, I don't go straight at, okay, this is transformative justice. I usually actually go back to punitive justice. I start out with like what we're used to and what we've been socialized into is punitive justice. And then I ask people, if I'm in a room full of people, even in, a room full of friends, I'll be like, how many of you grew up in an experience where you were punished when harm happened? And I give examples. You were expelled, you were put in detention, you're suspension, you're put on timeout. But the main move was you're removed from community in some way because you've done harm. And people are like, oh, yeah, everyone either has that experience or they were part of spaces where they saw that experience. And then I'm like, we grow that up so that then you go into prison or you get the death penalty or you get canceled from your community, right? It's the same process. So we live in this, that's what we're swimming in. And then I talk about restorative justice as a steps in the right direction, right? It's like harm has happened. How do we restore ourselves back to that relationship that existed before the harm happened? So I'm like, someone stole your purse. You get an apology. They do some community service. Hopefully we return to like where we were. But for me, I always say that doesn't go far enough because if the original conditions were unjust, then returning to those original conditions is not actually justice, right? You're just going to have someone who's like, great, now I returned everything to you. I still don't have anything and I'm still hungry and I still need something. I'm like, so we need to go further. So to me, transformative justice, the first aspect of it is that it goes all the way down to the root system of the harm and says, how do we change, heal, transform, pull this up? What do we need to do at the root system so that this harm is no longer possible? Like what we're trying to do is stop this harm from ever being possible again. And then how do we understand that the state is so committed to punitive justice, so the state is not going to be able to engage in transformative justice with us. So we don't go to the state to do this kind of deep work. And then how do we turn towards each other to hold this space? And in that turning to each other, we have to say, I believe you can transform.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to stop my share.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bailey, for your amazing presentation, the inspiration for, all that you are, all that you do, all that you've given the world. And I want to sort of add the piece here that the genesis of this came from Dr. Orr's sort of, leadership and forward thinkingness to pull together Black women academics, graduate students, and scholars when your book first came out to come together and have a small reading group of your work. And I think it is so important. And for students that have taken my classes, you hear me say this all the time. We have to engage the text. We have to do deep, close readings of the text because our work is often goes uncited, erased, but yet often deployed with very little understanding of what the hell we actually are writing and saying, right? So I want today's conversation to be an exercise in deep reads of your important work. But before we get started, let me remind folks to please post your questions, your comments, and your words of affirmation for Dr. Moya Bailey using the Q&A function. If you have her book, please hold it up. All right.
That's so sweet. Thank you. Thank you, Ashley.
Dr. Bailey, you pioneered the concept of misogynoir, and your book, Misogynoir Transformed, offers so many conceptual gems that really advance critical theory and activist scholarship. And in the book, you offer up a definition of transformation. So you say transformation is achieved only when change is evident in the way we move through the world and how we continue to incorporate that change throughout time. So in the spirit of dismantling misogynoir in everyday practice, how do you move through the world holding an ethic of care? And how do you bring this ethic of care to your life as a scholar, a teacher, a colleague, and a comrade in movements for change?
Oh, thank you for that beautiful question. So I feel like one of the ways I'm doing that now, I am newly an associate professor, and this is my first time having grad students working with grad students. And prior to this, I really understood myself to be on a mission to get back to Spelman and to be a teacher at a small little art school. I had no designs on graduate students. In fact, graduate students kind of make me nervous because there's so much anxiety there, rightly so. So part of my work is now is trying to create the graduate student experience that I didn't have and trying to be ethical in my relationship to them. And part of that includes I have a lab, which is called the Digital Apothecary. And part of my practice is building a lab culture that is sustainable and has Black feminist principles at its core. And that has meant that we move at the speed of trust. We're not in a rush to get things published. We're not in a hurry to get grants. We are writing the lab manual together. We are moving very, very slowly and trying to figure out what this space is going to be that isn't like a traditional social science lab, computer science lab, other STEM labs. How do we do it with a Black feminist ethic, and also thinking deeply about accessibility in terms of what we do. And I think that's one of the ways that care shows up in my work. And also in terms of my research, I'm always thinking about the people I work with as collaborators and not as research subjects. That's not language I use anymore. I talk about people as my collaborators. And when writing Misogynoir Transformed, I had a team, a council of people who I ran things by to kind of assess how might this land? Am I thinking about this in a way that makes sense? And still remaining in conversation and community with those folks is definitely part of my ethical considerations and how I try to be a scholar. And then the last thing I'll say is that I would not say that my primary identity is as an academic. I would say one of my primary identities is teaching, maybe, and then also a gatherer and an organizer. So I'm doing that inside of the academy, but I'm not of the academy. And this is something Barbara Ransby said to me many years ago, like, it's a job. and you shouldn't forget that it is a job. It does afford you the ability to do other things and leverage your job towards the service of organizing and other things, but it is not the work. It can help you do the work, but it's not the work.
So we have some amazing questions from our attendees. Thea and Felicia ask a question about practicing transformative justice in your life, especially for college students, particularly the example of sexual violence as something that is so prevalent for college students, right? How do we approach this issue, right? And also, how do we take steps to, I think this is the more sensitive part of the question, how do we take steps to remain in community with those who are misogynoiristic? And what does it mean to disrupt harmful practices that are meant to further abuse Black women?
Right. So here's the most important thing that I've learned about transformative justice, and I learned this from Miriam Kaba. You cannot have an accountability process a transformative justice process unless everyone agrees to it. So there is no holding someone accountable. That's not really something you can do. People have to volunteer and be invited into a space of wanting to change their behavior and be accountable for it. And it's really hard to do that when our system is so punitive. So why would anybody want to be in a transformative justice practice if they are going to be ultimately ostracized, ridiculed, etc.? When it comes to sexual violence, I think one of the things that has to change is not just the culture of the college campus, but the way that we as a society talk about the college experience. I think we as a society have accepted a narrative that sexual assault happens on college campuses. I think there's a way that we've just normalized that and said, yeah, sexual harassment, that's just a rite of passage. I mean, I'm thinking also about the language that we're getting from our Harvard colleagues about what has happened with the sexual harassment of these 3 students for all of this time. There's a sense that sexual harassment, sexual assault is kind of part of the college experience. And to shift that, I think we have to call out things that we see as they happen and not normalize them. And the difficulty with that is you can often feel like you're the only one. And part of this, I think, was so helpful to me at Spelman and other places was having groups of people, a critical mass, and a critical mass doesn't have to be a lot of people. When I talk about the Nelly incident, I mean, there were really like 5 of us who like actually wanted to do anything and thought it was an issue. And then it blew up into this other thing. It doesn't take that many, but having a critical mass to also remind you that your way of engaging, your way of seeing things is you're not alone. We're doing this together. We all see this.
Thank you for that beautiful response. So the next questions are from Andre and Robert. And these questions are really specific to existing as a queer Black woman in society, right? Would you say that simply living, existing as a queer Black woman is praxis against harmful forces of oppression? And how have you worked through your own internalized misogynoir, both towards yourself and other Black women, queer, non-binary, and gender variant folks?
Such good questions. I would say no, being queer is not inherently liberatory. And I would say that that's true of transness as well. I think, and this is a story that I share sort of anecdotally, I think I came into my queerness later than I could have because the models of queerness I saw were very normative, were very stud femme. And my gender expression didn't match that. So I didn't see myself in that, even though I was that. You know, I think that there's a formula in some ways around what queer masculinity looks like for Black women. And because I couldn't see myself in that, I was a little lost. And I would say too, part of my own internalized misogynoir was getting over my own kind of resistance to femme and femininity. Like there was a way that I think I was socialized to think of that as frivolous, as you know, all of the things that we learn, that's not serious, etc. And I think that's definitely one of the ways that my internalized misogynoir is something that I've been challenging and wrestling with, getting rid of those narratives about femininity as somehow less than.
So Harley is a student here at ASU and an organizer for a nonprofit called Black Political Cultivation Arizona. They also really enjoyed your book. So talk a little bit about ideas that you have on how organizers can connect with community members and really work to transform misogynoir.
Yes. One of the easiest ways is being in intergenerational community. I think one of the best parts of coming up as a young queer person in Atlanta was that there were so many queer Black elders around, and queer Black elders who tolerated our foolishness. Like, I remember a specific moment of being in conversation with Marianne Adams, who runs SAMI, which is an organization for older Black lesbians, and being very adamant that I am queer and not a Black lesbian. And, Marianne was very gracious and, just like, okay, young one, all right. And I feel that energy now when I'm listening to young people who are talking about, Libra gender and demigender void and things that I had never heard of in terms of how people are understanding and making sense of their gender and their queerness. So really trying to be compassionate and have that same spirit of like, okay, I'm gonna let you rock, young person. Even though this isn't my experience, but I wanna be supportive of you finding your story and finding the language that helps you make sense of your world.
Exactly. And that's an example of expressions of care, right? Holding that ethic of care, offering, as Dr. Orr says, offering that mutual respect, that love for each other, right? And that flexibility to allow folks to have their own experience, name their own experience, and learn from others.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. And this is this is wisdom that I got from Stacey Ann Chen. And it was just like, young people have a sledgehammer. When we get older, we get a scalpel. And I was like, oh, I really like that, because I really think that's one of the beauties of young people is that they're willing to literally fuck shit up. And sometimes that's what's necessary to get us to a new place. But in addition to that, sometimes we need nuance and we need the skill and delicate maneuvering of a scalpel.
Right. So Dr. Hall, who's a communication scholar, has a question. She says she'd love to hear more about how you grapple with the limitations of language. So terms like women, femmes, right? How do you come to make the choices you do? And what advice would you give to folks who want to acknowledge nuance and complexity of gender and sexual diversity, especially when the collaborators may be the focus, aren't queer, trans, non-binary, or gender variant folks?
Yeah, I mean, I really try to situate my language in a way that is responsive to how people are using terminology, both the collaborators that I'm working with, and then also kind of what's happening socially in terms of how language is moving. So it felt important to acknowledge that women and femmes was the language du jour of the moment. And so I wanted to say that in the book and then talk about why that didn't feel appropriate for me and my purposes. So I think that there's a really easy way of acknowledging what exists, but then talking about why you're making the choices that you're making around language. And that I think is an important practice. I'm also thinking about this in terms of, I think there was an earlier conversation about how Western constructions of queerness get written over what might be an indigenous or a local understanding of what queer can be. So the language of lesbian, gay, bisexual, might not be the language that people are using in other parts of the world. So I'm thinking about Gloria Wecker's work and in Suriname and the practice of Mati work, which is these relationships women have with each other. And that relationship, I think, is so important, but it doesn't exist at the level of identity. And I don't think that that's better or worse than people who identify as queer, but I think it opens up some different possibilities. And I think we might need to reckon with that a bit more. Did we lose something in the move to queerness as an identity? Are there things that we might not be making room for when we only understand queerness and gender through the lens of identity?
Right. And it reminds me of what Dr. Jeffrey McCune said earlier about the capaciousness of Blackness, right? And that there are these markers of identity that oftentimes we get, dare I say, lazy in our activism, that we make these assumptions that because we share the same rhetorical or linguistic markers of identity, that somehow we also share the same politics, we share the same experience, and we share the same understanding of how we are meant to move in the world. And it's an unfair and dare I say false way of thinking about difference, right?
Absolutely.
Right. So Gavin has a question on the connection that he's seeing between transformative justice and the concept of humanism that seems prolific in white liberal non-racist scholarship and discourse. So he says, I was curious if you'd be able to elucidate or refer some of the critiques of humanism. What's the meaning and or consequence of using this term? He said that he's seeing it more and more, and it feels like there's something essentially missing from its appraisal of reality. And thank you for your writing.
Yeah. So, I mean, in this context, I'm understanding humanism to not have an analysis of power. And I think transformative justice has a very clear analysis of power and how power operates in our lives and in the world. So transformative justice is really asking us to think about how we relate to each other when harm happens, not going to the state because the state will ultimately cause more harm. But how do we work within our community? How do we do the work of building trust so that we can have the relationships required to make accountability possible? And so I do think that there's something about the way humanism is operationalized that is still very much in line with a liberal, like a neoliberal individualist mindset. Like, I'm me. It doesn't really have a connection to the collective. And transformative justice is definitely thinking about how we relate to the collective always.
Yeah, absolutely. And transformative justice, it forces us to have to be mindful of the work that it takes to maintain and sustain right relationships, right? That again, we can't make these assumptions that because we are skin folk, that we're kinfolk, and that we are going to automatically be in right relation and community with each other, unless we put in the work and have processes and ethics and mechanisms in place to really build out the time it takes to build relationships, right? Or as Dr. Hall in the chat said, the analysis of power is missing and the absence is romanticized and it's glamorized, right?
Such a good point, Dr. Ward. And it has me thinking, this is my new controversial take, which is I feel like humans need to go back to hunter-gathering. I feel like society has gotten too big and we are too big to do the kind of accountability work required for transformative justice. I think we need smaller communities that do not require the level of infrastructure that our world has told us is okay and acceptable, because obviously it's not sustainable if you look at the environmental cost of the world that we're living in. And I mean, just thinking about the academy as one place, you know, there's people talk about, I think pre-pandemic, colleges and universities were using as much food as cruise ships in terms of their
That's right.
economic impact on the world. So I want us to think about that also. Are we doing this at too high a scale? Maybe we need to dial it back.
Right. I mean, I think when you're at, I think any size university, everyone is becoming well-versed in the discourse of innovation, adaptability, and scale. And scale is a synonym for up.
Yes.
But I think the harder work is, how do we scale back? How do we scale down? How do we scale to the level of the unit, to the level of the local, right? In order to do the work of building equitable and ethical relationships inside of our small communities, within our universities, within our local spaces. And then we can think about how we scale up. But you can't scale up until you get that right relationship with your local folks, right? Because there's a lot of performance going on, right?
Such a good point. And it also has me thinking about the limits of the university as our organizing container. Because something I also have been thinking about is, to the earlier question about sexual violence and sexual assault on campus, if we are waiting on the university to be the one to solve that, we're actually missing being in solidarity with the local community around what kinds of support resources might be useful. And I think there's something really wild that universities have their own police forces, their own processes that local community can't draw on, even though the university is benefiting from that local community in terms of taxes and all of those things. So really trying to shift our relationship to the local when we're in a university.
Yeah, and COVID is clearly a reminder of that, right? That universities are COVID super spreaders that have negatively impacted local communities, right? So we have two questions in the chat from Aaron and Raven that I think really speak to part of what we're talking about here. And that's around showing up in community as organizers, right? One, how do you keep up? I'm going to ask these sort of as a joint question. How do you keep up with information and knowledge about victims of state violence that often don't get talked about, and that don't get, as Raven says, that do not get proper coverage in the media? And I think that your response to that answer, Tim, I think will come from your identity as an organizer, right? So Aaron wants to know, how does organizing coincide and conflict with your role as a scholar, right? Because you told us, like, organizing is your, shall we say, master status vis-a-vis your identity as a scholar, right? So how are you keeping up with what's happening in spaces where you're not getting information? And then how does that identity as an organizer conflict with your identity as a scholar?
Well, I'll say that as a graduate student, it really conflicted, and it took me 8 years to finish my graduate program. And I don't know, I know people are getting out really quick now, like people are down to 5 years or 4 years funding, but it took me 8 years because I was half in, half out of my graduate program. I was attentive to organizing that was happening in Atlanta. That was where my focus was. The dissertation was there, but I wasn't too pressed about it in ways that I maybe should have been. And in that sense, I kind of let that fall by the wayside a little bit. And then in terms of things how I stay up on things, it's also about building relationships and having connections. So I'm new to Chicago, so I feel like I'm moving slowly into building the kinds of networks and community that keep me abreast. But part of that has been seeking out Instagram accounts and Twitter accounts that are based in the city, that are run by local activists and organizations, because I don't expect to see the things that really interest me on regular television.
Right. So our final question comes from Anna, and Anna is a student in Dr. Orr's class called Unruly Voices. And Anna asks, what unruly or being unruly means to you, or if you've had any personal experience being deemed unruly.
Yes, so I love this question, and I think that we need to return to and be more unruly. I think I was just talking in my class today about how we got the 8-hour workday, how we got Saturday and Sunday, how we got the weekend.
Yes.
Those were unruly laborers who said, absolutely not, we can't do this, this is not sustainable. And that unruliness was essential for things to shift. And I'd say I was unruly in a bunch of ways that I didn't actually understand as unruly at the time. You know, I've also talked about myself as being strategically naive in some ways, that I miss the cue that that's unruly and that's not something you should do. And I would say the Nelly protest was part of that. Like, we definitely didn't think that an international conversation about representations of Black women in music videos was going to erupt because we wanted to ask Nelly some questions about his latest video. Like, we did not, that was not even part of our consciousness. So I would say being unruly is part of breaking with the expectation that people might have of you and doing the work to go against the grain. And there's not a lot of support in that, but it's really powerful when we do it.
Well, let me close by offering some words of affirmation from Madeline. Madeline says, thank you, Dr. Bailey, for your vital work and expanding upon your conceptualization of misogynoir and including genderqueer folks. Thank you to all of the other amazing scholars from today's sessions who have spoken and will continue to speak. It's been a pleasure to learn from the deep wealth of wisdom that has been represented at this symposium today. So on behalf of all of the organizers and my colleagues in this struggle, thank you so much, Dr. Moya Bailey, for joining us, for delivering such a powerful keynote, and for the amazing, important work that you do. Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
At
this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Camilla Fojas, who is the director of the School of Social Transformation and foundation professor at Arizona State University.
Thank you. It's so hard to transition from listening to all these wonderful talks to thinking about closing out this program. As Dr. Ward said, I'm the director of the School of Social Transformation, of which African and African American Studies is a part, and this is the unit that has hosted this event. And as we think about and honor Black History Month, I'm reminded of the origins of Black History Month with Carter G. Woodson, who essentially established it in order to honor and reflect on and insist upon the study of Black intellectual history, culture, and traditions. And I think that lineage is really evident in a lot of the work that we heard about today. And I also want to say that this kind of work should persist beyond Black History Month. Obviously, this is a critical and intellectual tradition that I think not only have we heard about this today, but also the subjugated histories within it, queer histories, queer thought, queer thinking. And in the spirit of honoring those who have sort of established this and brought this forward, I really want to honor and thank Dr. Mako Ward, Marlon Bailey, Ursula Orr, who really made this program happen. You see their fingerprints all over it, but also this trio has been not only generous in putting this on, but generous in giving of a stipend that they received as the sort of triad of directors of African and African American studies last semester. They donated their stipend to the production of this event. And that to me is probably a sign of the most, not just true generosity, but you can see signs of their intellectual generosity here today. The other thing that I wanted to talk about and just kind of draw on, and something I've seen in all of the talks today, is that, well, part of the theme is around anti-Blackness. I think there's a real push from all of the speakers to move beyond that, to move beyond and displace the violence of anti-Blackness with the affirmation of belonging, with ideas of community and care, and to go beyond what Dr. Hall had referred to as the grammar of anti-Blackness, and what Dr. Al-Hassan calls the refusal of the death logic of the state, quoting in some part Achille Mbembe's work on the death logic of the state. So I wanted to just close by thanking everybody who's involved in this. Again, Dr. Bailey, Moore, Dr. Ward, Dr. Orr, and also everybody who has essentially brought this together, brought this to fruition. Lexa and Mike, Jean is involved in part of this, and just a robust and fulsome thank you to everybody that has been involved. And you make the work of SST engaging, dynamic. You make me want to show up every day to do this kind of work. And I want to close by talking about and just kind of promoting a couple of things that are coming up. So we have a couple of events on the horizon. There's one called Bonds Beyond Blood, Afro-Indigeneity and Urban Settler Colonialism, which some of you have kind of hinted at today in some of your talks, and that'll be on February 17th at 6 o'clock. And then the Critical Mixed Race Studies Association has its conference on February 24th through 26th. And Local to Global Justice Forum is also at the end of the month from the 25th and the 26th. And all of this information is on our website. And so I just want to close by thanking all of you and by asking you to come back to our events and continue this conversation that has been so generative and so dynamic that you've started today. So thank you all and have a wonderful evening.
So as most people know, usually this is when we stop the recording, we stop the live stream, all the speakers come on and we just kind of, stay in fellowship. So if folks who are attendees want to stay in fellowship for